What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
When my phone buzzed that afternoon, I was standing in my kitchen, half listening to a podcast and absent-mindedly scrolling through an email from one of my investors. And I assumed it was going to be my mom checking in to confirm what time I was arriving for Emily's engagement party. Instead, I opened it to a single sentence that made me stop mid-breath. "Don't talk about your startup tonight. Let her shine." That was it. No, hi. No, how's your day? Not even a fake smiley to soften the blow. Just a direct instruction, as if I were a stagehand who'd accidentally wandered onto the wrong set and needed to be reminded that the spotlight belonged to someone else. I stood there staring at the words, feeling that familiar mix of irritation and resignation that comes when someone tells you to make yourself smaller for the comfort of others. It wasn't even surprising, not really. Growing up, my mom had a very clear idea of who in the family was the achiever and who was the supporter, and Emily had always, without question, been assigned the lead role. Part of me wanted to reply with something sharp, like, "Don't worry, I'll try not to accidentally outperform her just by existing," but I didn't. I typed "sure" and hit send. And the second I saw those four letters leave my screen, I decided that I was going to do exactly what she asked. Not a word about the company I'd built from nothing. Not a single mention of the partnership I'd just signed that could take it to the next level. No humble brags about late nights or impossible deadlines. I'd sit there, nod politely, and let Emily have every inch of center stage. If they wanted me silent, I'd give them silence so perfect they wouldn't know what to do with it. The party was at one of those rented event spaces that try to look like a high-end restaurant, all faux exposed brick and open bar, with a playlist that made you feel like you should either be networking or pretending to enjoy tapas. People were laughing too loudly, hugging a little too long, making that small talk you make when you know you're only here because it's a big family thing. I kept my drink in my hand and my mouth shut, smiling just enough to be polite, but not enough to invite conversation. I figured the night would be the usual routine, Emily floating from group to group, my parents beaming, me strategically staying in the background. About an hour in, after the toasts from her friends and the obligatory speech from my dad about how proud he was, her fiancé, Mark, raised his glass. He's always been one of those guys who loves the sound of his own voice, the type who thinks a toast should be a performance. He thanked everyone for being there, said the standard lines about how lucky he felt to have found Emily, how she made him a better man, and I was only half listening because, honestly, I'd heard it all before. And then, without warning, his tone shifted just slightly, enough to make me look up. "Before we begin," he said, grinning like he had an inside joke the rest of us weren't in on, "there's something you should know about her and her ex." It was like the air in the room stopped moving. The laughter died mid-sound, glasses froze halfway to mouths, and Emily's face, which had been lit up with that perfect hostess smile, went so still it was almost unnatural. He didn't elaborate right away, just let the words hang there, looking around like he was enjoying the suspense. I caught my mom's eyes darting to my dad, then back to Emily, as if willing her to say something, to take control of the moment before it went further. And I just sat there, quiet, watching. Emily let out this half-laugh, the kind that's supposed to make you think it's all just light-hearted, but her voice cracked when she said, "Oh, stop, you're embarrassing me." Mark chuckled like he'd made his point and moved on with the toast, but whatever had been brewing in his head when he decided to say that was now brewing in everyone else's. You could feel it, the guests leaning ever so slightly toward each other, the way conversations started up again, but with a new undercurrent. The perfect, polished picture of their engagement had a hairline crack, and people were going to try to peer through it. When he finished, the applause was polite but scattered, and as everyone moved back into their smaller groups, I caught snippets. "Did you hear that? I wonder what he meant. Do you think he knows?" None of it was clear enough to be useful, but the fact that there was something to wonder about was obvious. My mother avoided my gaze completely, which, if you know her, is about as close to a confession as she'll ever give without words. I told myself to let it go, that it was none of my business, but the truth was I'd already stopped thinking about my mother's text, about the request to keep my own success under wraps. I had something much more interesting in front of me now. Whatever Mark was hinting at, it rattled Emily enough to make her lose her footing, and it made my parents look like they were sitting on a secret they didn't want anyone to know. And I have never been the type to look away when there's a secret just barely hidden in plain sight. I didn't speak up that night. I kept sipping my drink, kept my smile in place, and kept watching as Emily laughed a little too loudly and touched Mark's arm a little too often, like she was trying to steer him away from some invisible edge. But the image of her face when he said those words, and the way the room shifted instantly stayed with me. I left the party knowing two things for sure. First, that whatever my mother thought she was protecting Emily from by telling me to keep quiet, she had just handed me something much more powerful than a conversation about my startup, and second, that I wasn't going to ignore it. Not because I wanted to ruin my sister's engagement, but because I wanted to know exactly why a single sentence from her fiancé could turn her from the star of the night into someone who looked like she was just hoping to survive it. And the more I thought about it on the drive home, the more I realized whatever that something was, it wasn't just about her. I woke up the next morning with that same tight feeling in my chest that shows up after a night where you pretended everything was normal while your brain quietly stored every strange look and unfinished sentence like files on a messy desktop. And while I was making coffee, I saw two new messages in the family group chat, one from my dad thanking everyone for coming, with a line that sounded like it had been cut and pasted from a Hallmark card, and one from my mom reminding everyone that we would keep all future conversations positive, because this was a celebratory season, which is exactly the kind of language she uses when something has already started to crack, and she is trying to hold the wallpaper in place with both hands. And I stared at those messages and felt that old reflex to just be the cooperative one kick in. Then I ignored it and sent a simple reply that said I had fun, and I hoped Emily got some rest, because even though my mother's tone was controlling, I was not going to step into an argument where I would immediately be labeled the problem when in reality, the problem was already standing in the middle of the room wearing a ring and a smile that had slipped for a full 3 seconds when her fiancé made a joke that wasn't a joke. Around late morning, my mom called me, not to ask how I was or to circle back to the very generous request she had made about me staying quiet about my work, but to talk in that quick, clipped way she uses when she is trying to manage optics, telling me that Mark had had a little too much fun with his toast, and that it was nothing, that Emily was embarrassed but fine, that we should all just focus on the exciting things like venues and dates, and I said sure, because I have learned that there is no winning with someone who believes that reality is a story she can edit in real time if she just talks fast enough. I got off the phone and told myself I would leave it alone. Then I remembered the way Emily's laugh stuttered and the way my mother's eyes searched for my dad's face, and I knew I was lying to myself. Because you do not make a comment like that unless you are keeping something warm in your pocket that you think you might need later. That evening I drove a small box of gifts over to Emily's apartment, not because I wanted to be the doting sister, but because I wanted to see her, to look at her posture and her eyes and hear the version of events she was going to try to sell me. And when I walked in, she was doing that thing where she moved quickly around the kitchen to show she was fine, pulling out wine glasses and slicing cheese like she was auditioning for a commercial about everyday hosting, and I set the box down and watched her for a minute before I asked how she was doing in that tone that says I am not here to play along. She said she was exhausted, that people had talked way too much, that Mark's toast had gone long and weird, that he sometimes tries to be funny when he is nervous, and I listened without interrupting because when someone is scrambling you do not need to push. You just need to let the silence stretch until they start filling it with the truth they were trying not to say. I asked her what he meant about her ex, and she rolled her eyes in this exaggerated way and said he was referring to ancient history, that every relationship has baggage, that adults move on, that I should not give it oxygen, and I said okay. And then I said that sometimes people make comments like that because they feel like they're sitting on something they were told to ignore, and now it is burning a hole through their pocket, and that was when she stopped moving, set the knife down a little too hard, and said that I have always liked to turn little things into big things because I cannot stand it when she is getting attention. I wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so on brand for our dynamic. Any time I ask a real question, she changes the topic to my supposed jealousy like we are still teenagers. I told her I was not jealous, that I had purposely stayed quiet last night because Mom asked me to, that I am not interested in taking her spotlight, and that what I am interested in is making sure she is not about to walk into something with her eyes closed. And for a second I caught a flash of something honest on her face, this quick wince that said she knew exactly what I was asking, but then it was gone and she was back to shrugging and telling me not to ruin things. The conversation rolled off a cliff after that, and I left, but I did not drive home. I parked around the corner, sent one text, and waited. The text was to Mark. It was simple and polite and framed in a way that could not be called meddling, even though that is exactly what it was. I thanked him for hosting, said the night was lovely, told him I admired how much effort he was putting into the planning already. And then I added one line about a lesson I have learned the hard way with my investors and partners, that transparency early on always beats surprises later, that it might feel uncomfortable to lay everything on the table, but it saves you from humiliation down the road. I even included a link to a premarital checklist that a friend of mine, who is a therapist, had once sent me, one of those boring but useful documents that asks about things couples often avoid, like past debts, legal issues, credit score problems, restraining orders, and whether anyone has misrepresented themselves on applications or social media, and I sent it off with a smiley that I deleted before hitting send because I wanted the message to feel adult and neutral. He wrote back quickly, too quickly for someone who was at work, thanking me, saying he appreciated the thoughtfulness, asking if something had come up that he should know about, and I replied with a line so clean you could run it on television. That I am not getting involved in their business, and I only mentioned the checklist because it has helped people I know avoid misunderstandings, and then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and just sat there in the car letting the satisfaction wash over me. Because I had planted a seed that did not have my name on it, and that seed was going to sprout whether Emily liked it or not. I drove home and forced myself to focus on work for the rest of the day, but around dinner my phone lit up again, this time with a voice memo from my mother, which is never a good sign. She said Emily was upset because she had heard I had started something with Mark and that I needed to fix it, and I took a deep breath and called her back, told her I had done nothing except send a resource to someone who might find it useful, and that if Emily was worried, the easiest path forward was to be honest, because the people who hate checklists usually have a reason. My mother sighed that long, theatrical sigh she uses when she wants me to feel like I am the difficult one, and I told her I loved her and I would talk to her later. Then I hung up. Because for once I was not going to stand there while she tried to pin the entire family's discomfort on me. Around 9, my phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number with a screenshot of an old social media post that had Emily's name tagged and a caption about a business venture that went sideways. The comments full of words like owed, blocked, and agreement. And a message underneath that said, "You do not know me, but I figured you should see this before he does." I stared at the name attached to the screenshot, recognized it after a second as a friend of Emily's ex, and felt that cold clarity you get when puzzle pieces finally start to click in place. Then, right as I was deciding whether to ignore it or forward it, Mark's name popped up with a short text asking if I was free to talk for 5 minutes, and I realized the seed I had planted had already taken root. For a brief moment, I considered picking up and laying everything out with calm, surgical precision, because part of me wanted to control the narrative and make sure the truth did not get twisted, but the smarter part of me knew that saying less would mean more. That making him work to connect the dots would make the conclusions feel like his own, and that any truth he discovered without me would carry more weight than anything I could deliver directly, so I sent a short note that I was tied up, but would call him in the morning, and then, because I could not resist a small, clean strike, I forwarded the anonymous screenshot to Emily with a single line that said, "This is what people send me when I mind my business." And I turned my phone face down on the table and let the quiet settle. That was my first real move, small enough to deny if anyone tried to corner me, big enough to make everyone involved feel the ground shift under their feet, and as I washed the dinner dishes I could picture the 3 separate screens lighting up across the city. My mother's with a flurry of frantic messages to manage the optics, Emily's with a burst of defensive texts and a call she would not want to take, and Mark's with a checklist he would read line by line while thinking about a toast that landed wrong, and I knew that by the time I woke up, the story would no longer be just mine to tell, because the people who thought they were holding the strings had just realized the knots were tighter than they imagined. And one tug in the right place could make the whole thing loosen. I told myself I would sleep on it and let cooler heads handle whatever was bubbling, but the thing about pretending to stay out of it is that it only works if you truly do not care, and I cared. Not because I wanted to win some old sibling rivalry, but because I knew the shape of panic in my sister's voice and I recognized the particular kind of grin Mark wore when he raised that glass. The grin of a man who believes he has leverage and is testing how sharp it is. So the next morning I did what I always do when something does not add up. I started asking quiet questions to people who have no reason to lie to me, and I did it in a way that felt like catching up rather than snooping, which is a skill you learn when you have built a company by convincing busy people to tell you what they actually know rather than what they wish were true. I texted a mutual friend from college who had stayed friendly with Emily's ex, not because I thought she would spill gossip for sport, but because she works in finance and her sense of where money goes and why it goes there is sharper than most. And after a few warm lines about life and work, I asked a single, direct question about whether she remembered anything messy around the time Emily and her ex broke up, and the reply that came back was not long, but it was dense. A reminder that there had been a small business idea run on social media where pre-orders were taken for a product that never shipped. The refunds were late or partial. A handful of customers complained loudly. And then everything disappeared under a bland apology that blamed a supplier, and when I asked if the ex had been in charge of the money, she said no. He had been in charge of design, and Emily was the one who managed the payments because she said she was better with platforms and logistics, which I already knew was code for controlling the parts that involve bank accounts and access. I did not react. I did not moralize. I just asked for dates and whether any of it had ever gone beyond angry comments, and my friend said there had been talk of a small claim suit that fizzled because the amounts per person were not worth the headache. But there was one person who made loud noise and tagged everyone, and that person had written a long thread with screenshots that lived on a platform people tend to forget still exists, and I thanked her, changed the subject, and then sat very still because I could feel the outline of the thing I had been sensing. Not a criminal mastermind plot, not a dramatic scandal, just the kind of sloppy, avoidable mess that leaves a paper trail and a bad taste. The kind of mess you can outrun in dating if the other person is not very curious or is flattered enough to stop asking questions. I found the thread within minutes, because the internet never really deletes anything, and I read through a timeline that sounded exactly like something Emily would orchestrate when she wanted to look entrepreneurial without doing the boring parts. Lots of energy on branding and slogans, very little patience for fulfillment, and when the cash got tight, she held the refunds back long enough to bet that people would move on, which most did, except for the one who did not, and that one had posted screenshots of emails signed with Emily's name where she promised dates that never happened and then blocked the account after being pushed. And as I scrolled, I noticed a last update that mentioned the ex had tried to make things right by paying a portion himself after the breakup because he was tired of being painted as the reason orders were late, which told me two things I needed to know. First, that he had a conscience, and second, that Emily was comfortable letting someone else take the blame if it meant she got to save face. I sat with that for a while because it is one thing to be immature and careless and another thing to be comfortable with the idea that other people will absorb your fallout, and I thought about the checklist I had sent to Mark and the way he had asked if something came up. And I realized I did not need to tell him a story at all. I just needed to hold up a mirror in the right light and let him see what was already visible to anyone who bothered to look straight on. So I pulled the public link to the thread, used an old note app to save it as a tidy document with the dates at the top and the names redacted except for Emily's, and I sat there looking at it and gave myself a rule I knew I would follow. I would never put this in his hands directly, because I wanted whatever he learned to feel like it arrived from the world and not from me, which meant I needed intermediaries who were close to him but not loyal to her. You can call that manipulative if you want, but I have learned that in families like mine, the person who says the thing out loud is always the villain, even if that thing is true. So I would not be the one who said it. I would be the one who opened a door and let the draft do the rest. The first door was a simple move that looked helpful on paper. I sent a friendly text to the best man, a guy named Connor who had always been decent to me and who works in compliance, which is as good as it gets for someone who will notice red flags without having to be told to look for them. And I said I was putting together a list of vendors and tools for a friend planning a wedding, and I remembered he had mentioned a service that verifies deposits and contract terms for venues. Could he remind me of the name? And he sent me back the link with a note about how venues can be brutal with non-refundable terms and credit holds, which I already knew but appreciated having in black and white. And then I thanked him and added a line about another service that does background checks for small business partnerships, told him I had used it once to vet a lead, asked if he had heard of it, and he responded that he had and that it had caught a hidden judgment for an applicant once, and I said, "Wild how that stuff follows you," then stopped because that is all I needed, a nudge toward the idea that verification is not rude, it is smart. The second door was pettier, and I will admit it with no shame because it was effective and clean. I called the potential venue that Emily had been bragging about. Introduced myself with my full name because their sales team would recognize it from the deposit call my mother had already made. And I asked a few innocent questions about payment timelines and what happens if the cardholder and the primary contact are different people, and when the manager mentioned that they run a soft check on the primary contact if they are responsible for incremental payments. I thanked her and casually asked if that check includes prior chargebacks or disputed deposits, and when she said yes, I said that made sense given how many events fall through. Then I ended the call and waited, because I knew my mother would insist that Emily be the primary contact to show she was a grown woman and not a child, and I also knew there had been at least one disputed charge from that failed venture when the refunds went sideways, which meant the soft check would light up just enough to prompt a request for a different cardholder or an additional guarantee, neither of which fits neatly into the fairy tale script my mother needs to uphold. Those were my moves for the day, almost invisible, plausibly deniable, and positioned to make the people around Emily do the work that I refused to do for them any longer, and just when I was deciding to take a breath and get actual work done. My phone lit up with a message from the finance friend who had first pointed me to the thread, a short note that said she had run into the ex at lunch and that he had asked if Emily had ever repaid the outstanding refunds from that old mess, because he had covered more than he should have and was considering small claims again now that she was very publicly flush, and I stared at that line and understood that the past was not done with any of us. Because money is patient and humiliation waits for a moment to be most useful, and right then it clicked that my quiet setup was not enough. I needed one sharp gesture that would make the truth sit at the table even if everyone tried to ignore it. So I sent one email from a clean account with no signature, addressed to the generic inbox for Mark's office and copied to the best man's work address, with a polite subject about a vendor dispute that might touch their company's brand if linked via social tags. Attached the public document with the dates and redacted names, wrote 2 plain sentences explaining that a family member of a key employee was associated with the issue and that I was flagging it only because the thread had recently started trending again under a tag that included their company, and I hit send, sat back, and let the machine I had built start turning. Because I knew that within a day the link would be sitting in front of the 2 men who held the immediate future of this engagement, and whatever they chose to do with it would not have my fingerprints on it, which was the win I needed for now, crisp, efficient, and exactly as loud as I wanted it to be. By the time the end of the week rolled around and everyone was throwing words like rehearsal and seating chart and signature cocktail around as if they were charms that kept real life out, I had done enough groundwork to know that the story was going to move with or without me, yet I also understood that if I wanted the truth to land in a way that did not splash me with unnecessary fallout, I needed to nudge the timing so that the right eyes saw the right things in the right order, which meant I spent one long evening organizing everything I had into a neat, boring packet that looked exactly like the kind of thing a vendor would hand a manager during a routine audit, a timeline with dates spelled out in plain language, A few screenshots of public posts with account names hidden except for my sister's. A note that the ex had paid partial refunds after the breakup and had records, plus a short cover page that said nothing dramatic. Only that there had been unresolved disputes tied to a venture operated under Emily's name, and that anyone taking on joint obligations with her might want to confirm that all consumer issues were closed. A sentence so dry it could pass a legal department without setting off alarms, which was precisely the point. I told myself I was gathering these things for my own clarity, that I would sit with them and decide if letting them go into the world made me a terrible sister or a responsible adult. And then the universe made the decision for me because my mother called to say the venue had asked for an alternate cardholder or an additional guarantee since their system had flagged a prior dispute tied to a contact with Emily's name. And she dressed the news in a lecture about how unfair credit systems can be to women who try to do big things, and I said nothing about the irony of her pep talk because I was busy listening for the quiver in her voice that always shows up when the image she curates is under any kind of pressure, and when I heard it, thin and stubborn. I knew that what I had set in motion was already doing its work, carefully, quietly, without me in the frame. I saw Emily the next day because I offered to drive our grandmother to the rehearsal, and on the way I practiced the kind of neutral face you learn to wear when people you love insist you ignore a burning smell in the engine. And when we walked in, Emily was moving through the room with a brightness that felt like overcompensation, her smile too fixed, her laugh landing half a beat late, and I kept my voice soft as I asked if the venue had been sorted, and she said yes, that Mark had handled it. And then she added a little sting about how it is nice when your partner knows how to take care of things and does not make drama, and I almost thanked her for underestimating me because it gave me permission to follow through without guilt. Since she had made her choice to treat me like a problem rather than a person, and if there is one thing I have learned in business and in family, it is that when someone insists you are the enemy even while you are holding out a bridge, you lock your jaw. You put the bridge down, and you become the thing they are already fighting. The rehearsal itself was the usual chaos dressed up as planning, people clutching printouts and pretending they had strong opinions about the order of vows when really everyone was trying to figure out who was sleeping badly and why. And when there was a break for drinks, the best man, Connor, drifted over to me with that thoughtful look men in compliance get when they have seen something they cannot unsee yet are trying to decide whether it is their job to mention it, and he asked in a casual tone whether I had ever used a vendor background service for consumer disputes because he had seen one recently that had a surprisingly good index of public complaint threads, and I raised an eyebrow and said I had seen the same. Then switched the subject to seating because I did not want to be the person who handed him a story. I wanted him to reach for it himself, and he did that little nod that says he will follow the thought later, which was all I needed. My mother cornered me near the dessert table to deliver another reminder about keeping conversations upbeat, and I let her words slide past because I was focused on the envelope in my purse, the one that held the tidy packet I had made. And I had already picked my moment and my drop point, which would not be some dramatic handoff or a whispered exchange in a hallway, because theatrics give people permission to blame you instead of the content, so I waited until the rehearsal dinner seats were claimed and people had warmed up enough to stop watching one another. Then I set my purse on the sideboard near the spot where the wedding party had stacked their programs and place cards, a communal perch where people absent-mindedly tuck things. And I excused myself to help our grandmother with her pill organizer, which gave me distance and cover, and when I came back I pretended to rummage for lip balm while sliding the envelope half out of the purse pocket, the corner visible, the label. Simple, a bland word like documents that attracts the exact kind of curiosity group dynamics always generate when everyone is slightly bored and slightly nosy. This is the part where people who love to be righteous say I crossed a line, and I will grant that I did not choose the high road. But I chose a road that made sense in a family where saying a truth gets you branded disloyal while letting a man learn it on his own gets you branded wise, and the only difference between those labels is who has power. So I did not wait for approval from people who have never protected me when the target was on my back. The first person to notice the envelope was not Mark, which would have been too neat. It was Connor, who set his beer down, slid the edge of the envelope a little farther, and glanced around in that careful way hallmarking professional skepticism. Then he drew it out just enough to see the cover page, and I watched his face do the math and his eyes flick toward Mark as if testing how much of his friend's evening he was about to detonate, and right then the venue manager walked over with a clipboard to get a signature on a small update to the payment terms, the exact bureaucratic timing I could never have planned but appreciated like a gift, because now there were two clean lines of pressure converging without my hands anywhere near the valve. I did one more thing, small and surgical and merciful by my standards. I walked over to Emily and told her I needed to drop something at my car and asked if she wanted to come breathe for a minute, and when she said she was fine I nodded and left it at that. Because part of me still wanted her to take a step toward honesty on her own, and if she chose not to, then whatever happened next would not be something I had inflicted in private, it would be something that landed in a room where she had spent weeks curating applause. When I returned, voices were lower, chairs had that pushback angle that signals a conversation has turned from surface to substance, and I saw Mark holding the envelope by the corner the way people hold paperwork they did not ask for but cannot ignore. And my mother was halfway to him wearing the expression that has always meant damage control, and my father was staring at his hands the way he does when he decides his job is to say nothing and wait things out, and I knew we were at that thin hinge in time when the future could still pretend to look like the past, and then Connor touched Mark's sleeve and pointed at a specific line on the cover page, and Mark's mouth tightened. And Emily saw it and started moving toward them with that too bright smile she uses when she is about to start talking fast, and I felt my pulse pick up even though I looked calm, because the moment I had engineered without a confession was finally, inexorably, here, and the only question left was whether he would read the next page before or after she tried to snatch it back, which is exactly when the venue manager returned with the updated terms and asked, in a voice everyone around us could hear, which of them would be the responsible party for future charges. And Mark looked at Emily and then at the envelope, and then at me. The way Mark looked at me in that second after the manager asked who would be responsible told me everything I needed to know about where his head had gone, because it was not a glare and it was not a plea. It was the expression of a person who has just realized that the version of events he was handed came without footnotes, and suddenly he wants sources, and before I could blink, Emily launched into that cheerful, breathless tone she uses when she wants to cover ground fast, telling the manager she would sign whatever needed to be signed and that her mother would back it with a family card and perhaps it would be simpler if they did the paperwork later, and I watched Mark's jaw set in a way I had not seen before. A quiet refusal that does not require volume to be heard, and he said he wanted to review everything together, tonight, now, before commitments got layered on top of half-answers, and that there was no rush to sign a single thing until they were both comfortable, and, while he was speaking I saw Connor slide the envelope a little higher on the table so the cover page faced Mark and not my mother, who was already inching closer with that soothing tone she uses on men when she wants them to agree to something that benefits her. I stood there and kept my promise to myself, which was that I would not make speeches, I would not narrate, and I would not rescue anyone from the consequences of choices they had every chance to correct. So when Emily turned to me and tried to pull me into the theater with a line about how I was overreacting and how old internet noise should not be allowed to ruin a future, I only said that I had no desire to ruin anything and that sometimes the simplest path forward is the cleanest one, which is to put the truth on paper, decide how to address the past, and then choose whether you still want the future, and if getting to that truth in front of a manager and a best man felt uncomfortable, maybe that was because it had been ignored for too long. The manager excused herself with professional speed. The room's small talk stalled and then split into two currents, one that pretended to focus on centerpieces and one that watched us with unhidden curiosity. And Mark opened the envelope while Emily reached for his wrist, a gesture that would have looked protective if it had not been time to interrupt, and he gently pulled his hand away and read in silence. Then asked Connor a few low questions that I could not hear word for word, but did not need to, because the shape of the exchange was familiar to me from boardrooms where men compare a company's story to a ledger and decide which one is lying. When he finally looked up, he did not look angry. He looked steady in that frightening way that means a decision is coming that will not be negotiated, and he asked Emily to step into the hallway with him. And my mother started to follow, and he said he wanted a moment alone, and there was a ripple in the air like the sound of a curtain falling, and I put my hands on the back of a chair and waited, because the next minutes were not mine. They were gone longer than anyone wanted, long enough for two bridesmaids to unpin their hair and a groomsman to whisper that he had always thought the engagement was too fast. And when they came back, Emily's face had the tightness of someone who had tried to outrun a question and hit a wall, while Mark had the drained, alert calm of a man who has chosen clarity over comfort. He asked for everyone's attention without theatrics and said the rehearsal dinner would end early, that the ceremony would be postponed until further notice, and that he and Emily needed time to resolve a few items that should have been resolved before the invitations went out, and a hush settled that was sharper than any gasp because it pulled the oxygen out of the room in one clean sweep. And my mother moved toward him with a trembling smile and a line about misunderstandings, and he cut her off with a quiet thank you for the hospitality and a note that he would not discuss private matters in a room full of guests. Then he set the envelope down exactly between them, like a placemat no one could pretend not to see, and walked toward the exit with Connor close behind, who paused just long enough to give me a look that held zero accusation and one sliver of gratitude, the sort of acknowledgement men in his job give when someone else has done the hard pre-work of telling the truth, without saying it out loud. Emily rounded on me with a heat I recognized from childhood, the kind that says blame is cheaper than accountability, asking if I felt proud, asking if this was my version of support, asking if I could not stand one night that was not about me. And I kept my voice even because rage loves a raised tone and I refused to feed it, and I told her that I had not canceled anything, that postponing is a gift when the alternative is walking into a contract you are not prepared to honor, and that I would gladly help her make a plan to settle whatever was unsettled so that she could walk toward whatever future she still wanted with no one at her back waiting to collect. And she laughed that raw laugh that says none of this is landing because pride is drowning out hearing. And she said she did not need my charity. So I gave her the opposite of charity and handed her the only lifeline I would trust if I were in her place, which was a printed sheet with a simple set of steps written in plain, unemotional language. That there is a list of customers from that old venture who are still out money, that a third-party escrow can be opened within a day to hold funds for repayment, that a public statement can be drafted that admits errors without inviting a lawsuit, that restitution with receipts closes loops faster than excuses, and that once the refunds are processed and the statement is live, the venue will stop asking questions because venues do not care about morality, they care about risk, and if she wanted help executing any of it, I had a contact in compliance who would do it discreetly for a fixed fee, and I said it all while looking her in the eye so she understood that this was not a victory lap, it was a blueprint she could pick up or throw away. She crumpled the page, of course she did, because humiliation hates logistics, and my mother told me to go home, and I did, but not before I placed a small card on the sideboard next to the half-empty tray of desserts. A card that simply listed an email and a subject line phrase for anyone who believed they were owed money from a past purchase to submit their receipt, and I did that because I knew the room had already split into those who would whisper and those who would help. And I wanted the helpers to have an action that did not require my sister's permission. The next morning my phone was a battlefield of messages, my mother insisting I fix what I had broken, my father asking if I could come by to talk, because he was tired of living in a house where truth had to ask for a seat. A short text from Connor confirming that Mark had taken the night to think and that he would not make announcements until Emily decided whether she wanted to repair or defend. And a handful of emails from strangers who had seen the card and attached screenshots and old invoices with a kind of relief that made my throat tighten, because they did not sound vengeful, they sounded tired. I forwarded every single one to a bare-bones inbox I had set up the week before, and I sent a single email to Mark with the subject line that said repayment plan proposal and the message body that said, if she wants it, it is ready. It requires her signature and nothing else. By evening an escrow existed with a clean name. A short statement went live on a public page that did not beg for sympathy and did not throw anyone under a bus, only acknowledged what happened and promised refunds by a set date. And the first transfers hit the queue within hours because money moves fast when ego gets out of the way. And I did not hear from Emily directly, but I heard from my grandmother, who said in that plain way old women have that the right thing had finally been done by someone in this family, and that people can call it revenge if they need a word for it, but to her it looked like a door had been opened that had been nailed shut for too long. As for the engagement, it did not implode in a dramatic blast. It went quiet and careful, which is more honest, and while they took time, the timeline shifted from sprint to walk. And whether they ever make it back to an aisle is not my problem to solve or my story to finish, because my part ended the minute the refunds started and the lies stopped needing a babysitter. And when my mother finally called to say she did not recognize the person I have become, I told her I have always been this person, the one who stays silent until silence hurts someone other than me, and then I act, cleanly, without apology, and if that makes me the villain in a house that worships the appearance of harmony, I can live with the title. Because what I cannot live with is a family that confuses complicity with love. I never mentioned my startup through any of it, not once, and it turns out I did not need to, because when you build something real, your work speaks for you even when you keep your mouth shut and when you refuse to decorate a lie. Truth arrives like a final move you have been lining up for years without even knowing it, and when it lands, the sound it makes is not cruel. It is clean, a soft yes that you hear inside your own chest, and it keeps echoing long after the room stops talking.